College football experienced quite a shakeup about a decade ago, of course, when Texas A&M and Missouri left the Big 12, joined the SEC, and the dominoes fell in the Big 12 and the Pac-12 and the Big 10 from there. And we've heard rumors throughout the years about conference expansion, super conferences, mega conferences, 16-team conferences, but we've never been this close to seeing the power brokers of college football move to other conferences. Oklahoma, Texas to the SEC. That is what has been rumored. That is what has been, to a certain extent, substantiated in regards to the Oklahoma and Texas contact with the SEC and reaching out to the conference for membership. We got Steve Helwick on the line from SB Nation, and also Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football, two of the best people I can think of, especially to represent the two universities involved. Appreciate both of you being here. Steve, we know that you're dealing with American Conference Media Days right now, or Conference USA. Where are you involved with the calls right now?
This week's CUSA Media Day. They're doing the West today.
There we go. So, Steve, we appreciate you jumping on. Steve has joined us on a regular basis for a long time. He's covered Texas football for a number of years, attended and graduated from the University of Texas, and covered the team right there on campus and also with the Daily Texan. So, Steve, your initial thoughts about when you heard the news and your initial impressions?
It's bizarre news. I mean, this is a thing that could really shake up college football as a whole, and the Big 12 could be just a huge loser of this situation, especially when it has an upcoming TV contract expiring in 2023. So they really need to throw a Hail Mary out right now to save the conference. I know Texas and Oklahoma, nobody of those universities has denied the reports that they've outreached to the SEC to join. And there's going to be a lot of loopholes and things that they'll have to go in, which will be manageable just due to the sheer amount of money alone. But things like 11 out of 14 SEC teams approving them to go to the conferences, things like the Longhorn Network TV deal, which currently runs through 2031 and gives a lucrative amount of money to Texas. There's state legislation, I believe, that states that Oklahoma and Oklahoma State must play in the same conference. So there's a lot of things going on right now that are against this. And I said I cannot believe that 11 out of 14 teams in the SEC would want to approve this. I believe Texas A&M and Missouri have already been hard-nosed. And I don't really see any current SEC member really benefiting from this decision. And once again, it feels like it would shake up the college football landscape as a whole, where we would just start seeing a lot of disaster happening. I don't know what the future of the remaining 8 Big 12 teams would be, if they would stay in the conference, if AAC teams might join them, if they might join the AAC, or what could come domino effect of this. But if anything were to happen, this could be bigger than the whole conference college football landscape reshaping in around 2010 to 2012.
How significant, Steve, do you think is the divide between Texas and the rest of the Big 12 in regards to the cohesion of the conference, being on the same page, pulling in the same direction? There seems to be a lot of talk out there about how Texas rules the Big 12. The rest of the members have to be subservient to Texas. There's a lot of animosity. Maybe that's why Nebraska, partially one of the reasons why Nebraska left the Big 12, is that Texas doesn't exactly represent the rest of the conference, and the rest of the conference, Texas.
It definitely was a contributing reason, it felt like, for Texas A&M departing to the SEC, a move which has worked out pretty well for the Aggies. But yes, I know a lot of Big 12 members just aren't happy with the Longhorn Network deal, and Texas always wanting to be at the forefront and center of the things. I feel like they do roll the conference in a financial way, although Oklahoma clearly rolls the conference in an on-field football way at the moment. But Texas will always get by with the donors, which are known to control the program in Austin. And that's just the money will always be a huge thing for Texas. And that's what I said, even with the Longhorn Network contract running through 2031, I feel like that's a loop they can get through just with the sheer amount of money they'd be getting from the SEC. It's like when you buy out it's like when a university hires a coach off of an AAC program, and they're willing to pay the major buyout.
Hey, Steve, before we let you go, who, if this goes through, of course, if it doesn't, we don't have much of a discussion or anything to worry about, but if it goes through, in regards to the Big 12, what do you think are the most viable options to try to maintain that conference competitively as a football conference?
I'd say immediately reach out to Memphis, Cincinnati, UCF, and maybe just, I know they're struggling right now, but South Florida, just to maintain their rivalry with the UCF and also get that Tampa market. Florida is also a good recruiting hotbed. I mean, geographically, the conference won't be as convenient. I know they already have West Virginia, so you could maybe make an East Division out of that with Cincinnati, Memphis, West Virginia, and those two Florida teams to try to save the Big 12, then have the Kansas teams, Oklahoma State, Baylor, TCU, Texas Tech out west. But this could be very major if it happens, and there's going to be a lot of immediate domino effects if anything were to happen. But I'll have to say, just with Texas and Oklahoma's dissatisfaction with the Big 12, it does seem like things have gotten to a fallout where it might not be redeemable at this point. Oklahoma is a very confusing one to me, just with their automatic berth to the college football playoff nearly every single season, just because they win the Big 12 every year. They've won it every single season since 2015. So I feel like from a competitive standpoint of rolling the college football landscape, joining the SEC won't be as big of a benefit to them, although it would make sense from a monetary standpoint.
Steve Helwick joining us from SB Nation, and you see his affiliations right there. Please join him on Hustle Belt and Underdog Dynasty, and because of those affiliations, he's got to run off to cover Media Day. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you. Appreciate you for having me on.
All right, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. We're joined as well by Tony Siracusa from Last Word on College Football. So I am in a 2-for-1 here with Last Word on College Football, but that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That's a good thing because I rely on these guys on a regular basis to support the product and deliver the content and get the facts straight and the analysis and insight. So, Jason, you were first to the party, so we'll start with you as an Oklahoma guy that Jason is solely responsible along with myself, but we wouldn't have an Oklahoma Live show every Friday without Jason. So join us there, 2:30 Eastern, 1:30 Central on our Oklahoma channel. But I'll just throw out the broad topic to begin with. Your initial thoughts and impressions when you heard the news.
Yeah, I think it's kind of crazy, Mark, when you think about it. Mid-July, late July, we're really focused on conference media days, getting ready for fall camp, and certainly getting ready for the season to start. And then this bombshell gets dropped yesterday afternoon. So I think first and foremost, Mark, I think it's really important to understand really kind of the paradigm shift within college football really at this point. We're in the middle of how big the transfer portal is. We're in the middle of NIL kind of getting started. And then, you're talking about the college football playoff expansion, which is probably inevitable at some degree. And then you talk about certainly that kind of drop. Then you'd alluded to about, I think it was about 9-10 years ago, the rumor of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State and Texas, and I think Texas Tech moving to the Pac-12. Certainly it didn't end up being that, but I think there's been no shortage of desire, specifically from the Oklahoma side, to get away from the Big 12. I think it's a variety of different things. When you look at over the last, 6-7 years, the Big 12, when you stack that up against all of the major Power 5 conferences, they're probably right there with the Pac-12 in terms of, lower tier Power 5, and you have Oklahoma, who has, kind of carried the the bell for the conference, so to speak. And then, you've got Texas as a huge brand. So, you think about it, it was a little bit surprising, but not altogether too surprising. And I think the one thing that, we've talked a lot about this internally, but I think the one thing that you're seeing is no one's really outright denying this. So I think there's certainly a lot of legs to this. Now, I think the one thing that has to be considered here is the Big 12 grant of rights doesn't end until 2024-2025 season. So if Oklahoma and/or Texas were wanting to make this move, and if they wanted to leave early, they would have to lose out or pay somewhere to the tune of $70 million to be able to leave early. Now this is already out there, so the chances of if Oklahoma and Texas make this move, the chances are they probably would leave before that time, because just the politics around the Oklahoma and Texas and the Big 12 at a short-lived time, probably won't work out in their favor. So, those are some things. And of course, the lawyers will get involved at that point. It certainly won't be $70 million that they pay, but, if that happens. And I think it's, and when you think about from the SEC, I know there's a lot of questions been asked, why would the SEC want to do this? And it seems like, we don't have any specifics in terms of, it looks like at this point, this has really just been Oklahoma and Texas reaching out to the SEC. Sankey has been very tight-lipped on this, no comment. We're not commenting on, any rumors at this time. But, you think SEC obviously is the premier conference in college football. And this is probably just a power play for them, right? When they have the best conference, and if they add a brand like Texas, certainly on the field, production hasn't been, over the last 10 years hasn't been, what they're used to from a reputation perspective. But Oklahoma maybe doesn't have as powerful as a brand, but their on-field performance is much better. So you look at that from a power play perspective. You look at there's some rivalries that would make sense with Oklahoma and Texas going to the SEC. You would think you have an old Texas Arkansas rivalry that would be renewed. You certainly have Oklahoma and Texas A&M, Oklahoma and Missouri that have played each other for quite some time. But aside from that, I think the previous gentleman Stephen mentioned this. There's going to have to be 11, I believe 11 out of 14 members will have to vote yes in order for this to happen. We already know, all of us know, that there's no way that Texas A&M votes yes. Missouri is, it's kind of interesting. Missouri's, I would say, probably a no, but listening to some of Eli Drinkowitz's comments in the SEC media day, he seemed to be very inviting of this to happen. So at the cuff, you don't really look at any other teams that would probably vote against this. Maybe you could make a case for the Mississippi schools that could vote against this, but it seems to me, kind of on the cuff, there's a strong win-win for both sides of the coin, so to speak. And the last thing, Mark, that I want to make sure that we clear up, and that there's no legislature in the state of Oklahoma that prohibits Oklahoma and Oklahoma State from playing in the same conference. Now, certainly there is there'll probably be some political pressure for Oklahoma to bring Oklahoma State, should they decide to go to the SEC or wherever the conference is that they might look at. But there is no legislature. I think the one thing before that we had talked about, and this kind of came up with the Pac-12 decision a few years ago, was that David Bourne was the president of Oklahoma. He had a lot of ties independently with Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. So I think he was a big driving factor in really putting that narrative out there. And that's not necessarily the case anymore, obviously, with him no longer being the president of Oklahoma. So, I think it's been interesting to see exactly how this plays out over the next few months. There was a report out last night that said that basically talked about Oklahoma and Texas, within a couple of weeks could be letting the Big 12 know that they intend not to re-up on those grant of rights, and outside of that, they would look to, pursue membership into the Southeast Conference. So, you look at that, and then you look at, is it a power play? Is it a kind of a negotiation, runoff for Oklahoma and Texas? Maybe not. The SEC is not the answer, but maybe it's a ploy that says, oh, we're very much out there. We're very much not looking to stay in the Big 12 long term. We want to, move on to, perhaps another conference, whether it be SEC or wherever that might be.
We appreciate everybody being online. We will acknowledge your comments and questions as much as possible. I'm joined by Jason Ray, Last Word on College Football, Tony Siracusa from Last Word on College Football, a couple guys that I lean on heavily in these type of circumstances, especially Jason in this matter with Oklahoma involved. Tony, my Pac-12 guy, but follows all of college football, understands the inner workings of these kind of situations. So, Tony, we appreciate you stopping by. As I see this, Tony, there are a number of components that you can look at. The academics, the money, the geography, forget the tradition, the culture. That seems to be going by the wayside even more so with this move as it has in past moves, where when I think of college football, traditionally, I think of different areas of the country and different conferences symbolizing and representing those areas of the country. And that being one of the just character aspects of college football, one of the engaging, inviting aspects of college football is that you think of the Big Ten and you think of certain schools and you think of a certain brand and vibe and environment. The SEC, the Pac-12, they all had their different flavor that when it was all brought together, just made for a beautiful scene across the country of college football. But that's been torn to shreds to a certain extent, and this would just kind of further us in that direction. So it comes down to money, comes down to some type of academic considerations of what schools have what academic standing and how that might be voted on. So before we'll certainly down the line get to the Pac-12 possibilities and how it may impact the Pac-12. But just in regards to how you see this playing out, I see this as a detriment to college football, because if you just look at it from a competitive standpoint, the SEC is already the best conference. We can debate on how wide that gap is, but I don't think it's debated in regards to it's the best conference on the field. Then it adds two heavyweights. There are just not enough players in the game out there for the Big Ten or the Pac-12 to grab to bolster their conferences to reach that kind of level that we're going to be concentrated in the Southeast in regards to the power of this sport. Going forward, you can grab up Memphis and Houston and Cincinnati and all you want. You're not going to compete with those 16 teams. So I just see it, unless I'm missing something from a competitive standpoint, to be a detriment to the sport.
I think you bring up a lot of good points. One, I want to commend you for having both Jason and I on together at the same time so that you win the hair follicle award among the three of us. I think you did it on purpose. But to get to your real points, look, you and I, we can all go back to the days of regional football, and we remember the old Southwest Conference, which was all schools in the state of Texas plus Arkansas, right? And the Pac-12 or the Big Ten was all Midwest schools, and the Big Eight was schools in that part of the country. But now you look and they got West Virginia in there. I think the geography of college football has been thrown to the wind quite a bit over time. The Pac-12 adds a school like Utah, which is, further out than any of the other schools that they previously had. And I think, you look to add whatever schools will lend some more credibility to your conference, certainly more revenue to your conference, big market programs. Does it ruin college football? I'm going to say you're not bringing two heavyweights to the SEC. I'm going to say you're bringing 1.5, because I'm not convinced Texas is a football heavyweight right now. And I don't think they have been for a few years. They're a blue blood in the fact that they have the history and the notoriety and all of that. But they're not a competitive major player in college football right now. Who knows what Sarkisian does? The one thing it does do is it brings you the Austin media market, and well outside of Austin, because the fan base for the University of Texas reaches well outside its own home city. So it brings you that. It brings you that media. It brings you that notoriety. What it does from a competitive standpoint, whether it be recruiting or on the field, is, I think, very TBD. Right now, Oklahoma has been carrying the conference for a lot of years, not just in football, but in some of the Olympic sports, in softball, in gymnastics and other things that are non-revenue sports for the most part, but are still worthy of any college athletics discussion. And so, I think that frankly, from a college football standpoint, a fan standpoint, I don't like the move. Only because I don't like seeing the SEC get bigger than it already is and getting more dominant than it already is. But that's strictly from, someone who grew up, like you said, with all the traditions of, where schools were and who they played. But you also have to recognize change just happens, and it's just the way it is. Like Jason said, whether it's the NIL or whether it's the transfer portal, change just is. I thought it was kind of funny earlier today when during the SEC media days when Eli Drinkwitz, the Missouri coach, got up and said, the first question I have is horns down going to be a penalty in the SEC next year? I thought that was pretty clever. And I think that there's a lot of unknown because, look, where did the story come from? And I think it matters. There is no way Greg Sankey or the SEC leaked this story. Greg Sankey is the most button-up commissioner in college sports, maybe in sports, period.
And not this week, he wouldn't leak it.
No, of course not. But my point is he wouldn't leak it until he knew he had the votes lined up to get the approval. This would have been completely shut down until he talked to the schools. There is a little bit of motivation for Oklahoma and or Texas to leak it. The one with the biggest motivation to leak it is Texas A&M to try and kill it before it gets too far. Because if you're having secret, quiet conversations and Sankey is meeting with the schools and having these, offline conversations, the train winds up halfway down the tracks before it becomes public, and then it's too late to do anything about it. We're at the very early stages of this still. The one with the motivation to kill it as quickly as possible is Texas A&M. So while they're playing coy of, gee, we don't know, gee, we'd like to be the only Texas school in the SEC, well, I'm sure you would. You're also the one with the biggest motivation to leak this. So I think there are a lot of particulars, like Jason was talking about with the TV rights and the grant rights and all of that. This is not going to happen next week. This is going to happen if it does happen, and I do tend to think it will. The actual departure from the conference is a year or two away because there are the financials that have to be dealt with. There are the contracts that have to be dealt with. There is no way the Longhorn Network survives a transition into the SEC under the current arrangement where Texas keeps all the money. The University of Texas keeps all the money. There is no chance the SEC allows that. They're going to soap up the windows and lock the doors on the Longhorn Network. And, thanks for the years of watching. So there are a lot of logistical things that have to go into this before it happens. But I do see, like Jason said, you have to have 75% approval from the current SEC schools to do this. If you do the math, it brings you out to 10.75 schools. So you have to have approval from 11 schools. Texas A&M is going to vote no. I do think Missouri probably votes no. I'm on the fence about where Arkansas comes down, because Arkansas, if you listen to their administration, you listen to them during football media days, and again, bear in mind when it comes to football media days, we're talking to the coaches, and they're not going to be the ones that make these decisions at all. It's going to be the administrations and where it comes down with money and how it comes down with alignment. You talk about, they'd like to renew the rivalry with Texas that they had, in the old Southwest Conference days and things like that. But that's coach talk. The administrations will listen to the coaches, but ultimately it's the athletic directors and the school presidents and chancellors that will make the decisions.
I think with some of these mid-tier SEC schools, and I don't know how the administrators are going to think this through. I'm sure they've got their calculators out first and foremost to figure, okay, and as things stand, you guys can correct me, the latest numbers that I saw had the SEC and the Big Ten earning about $65 to $67 million per football playing school. And then there was a drop to ACC, Big 12, 32, 35 million,
Mhm.
somewhere in that range. And then the Pac 12 was a few million behind that. And those
Right.
are the latest numbers that I saw. So you add Oklahoma, Texas, you got to divide the money two more times. But of course, you bring two just substantial brands into the mix. So some of it's obviously anytime you work a budget like you do your household budget, you've got your known commodities, but then
Right.
you've got your entertainment on the other end. Then you've got somewhere in the middle where we can spend maybe $35 a month for water, or might shoot up to 45. But so you've got your various expenses that you weigh out, and you've got your known commodities all the way through to your unknowns or your projections. I would just think from a football, I think too much from a football standpoint, but that obviously rules the whole deal. Money, football,
Mhm.
academics, there's consideration. I know that the Big Ten has been maybe the most outspoken or the most known for blocking or not considering schools because of academic non-affiliations. But I would just think schools, again, from a football standpoint, like Ole Miss and Mississippi State, that are already in some people's eyes irrelevant or not significant, even lose more luster or significance and just become buried in this sea of 16 schools playing football and further down the pecking order. That I don't know. Again, the money is going to dictate a lot of decision in this, but where from a competitive balance standpoint, that a lot of schools may not want two giants headed into the league to further suppress them.
Yeah, look, I think from a conference standpoint, and you talk about the pecking order and what happens if you add two, blue bloods like this. Do the Missouri schools lose? Yeah, probably. Kentucky probably loses some cachet. Certainly Arkansas and Missouri lose, whatever cachet they currently have. A&M loses a lot of cachet because while they're having some success and look to have a really good, strong season this year, they're not the marquee name that Texas is on, Saturday television, or that Oklahoma is on your Saturday game of the week on ESPN. So I think that there's probably 5 or 6 schools that drop down the perception pecking order, we'll call it, the perception of where they are in the world of college football relative to being in the SEC.
Yeah, Jason, well, you both addressed the Texas A&M athletic director's comments, which he didn't name Texas, but of course he was pointing them out, saying we want to be the only school playing football, playing athletics in the state of Texas as a member of the SEC. But, you look at a situation like Missouri, they're an outlier geographically, but they can go into households in a recruiting standpoint and say, we play in the SEC, we play in the best conference in America, and they're impacting and contacting a different set of recruits in a lot of circumstances than their competitors in the SEC, but they're competing more with Big 12 schools, I would think, in a lot of instances for recruits, but they can say we're playing in the SEC. Well, that's taken away from them, I would think, unless it's strictly a matter of we're getting the calculator out, and if we can make more money, then we're just going to vote yes, that Texas A&M, Missouri, and Arkansas, from a recruiting competitive balance standpoint, want no part of this right out of the gate.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Mark. And kind of interesting that you bring up the recruiting side of it. I think Tony had talked about Eli Drinkowitz in some of his comments, and there were some comments that he made that he reached out to a lot of his recruits that he's battling against Oklahoma, Texas, Big 12 teams, and say, and here's the conversation. See, these guys want to come join this conference. So, I think you certainly can take that a couple of different ways. Does it give Oklahoma and Texas maybe an additional competitive advantage moving over to the SEC, telling them how good of a conference that they can play in, not only the tradition that they have at these schools, particularly at Oklahoma over the last 10 years, but certainly moving over to a conference like that. And as we know, Tony illustrated it very well, that the athletic directors and probably more importantly the chancellors and the presidents are going to be the ones that's going to make these decisions. And a large part of it's going to be money, as opposed to quality on the field. But I think another thing to think about this, certainly in the realm of money, could this end up being sort of a kind of a network battle? We've talked a little bit about, me and you, Mark, about Oklahoma's displeasure on getting so many of these 11 a.m. kickoffs that are mostly tied to that Fox contract. And to a certain degree, there's the school of thought that Oklahoma, you signed up for this, you kind of have to deal with it, certain side of it. But I think the situation kind of remains that there's a lot of displeasure with that. And Bob Bowlesby in his opening comments, sort of kind of just said the same thing, like, Oklahoma, you're going to have to deal with it. So, there's certainly some animosity, I think, between Oklahoma and the Big 12 and Oklahoma and Fox. But, the big contract that ESPN landed with the SEC sort of kind of taking over for a CBS perspective, it's when you look at ESPN, they've loosened that competitive side. They've pretty much eliminated CBS. Now it's really the Big 12/Fox, partnership with ESPN and the SEC. If ESPN or the SEC, however you want to say it, pulls Oklahoma and Texas over to the SEC, it's really kind of, what advantage does Fox have at that point, specifically for the Big 12? Certainly they have, they're not going to completely die over it, but at the same time, you have to understand that, the networks are going to play a big part in this, just from a decision-making perspective. So, what does that look like? And we've talked about what were the conferences, what were the divisions look like? You and a lot of, Georgia, Florida probably moves east, right, at this point. And you have, Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, and Florida. And then you have, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, Missouri, LSU, Arkansas, and then the Mississippi schools. That's probably what that looks like. So, the competitive advantage. I think the thought that I've seen a lot of through some of the comments here, and then just anecdotally, is Oklahoma goes to the Big 12. They're automatically there's not a chance they make the playoffs in that conference. Well, when you look at it from a division perspective, specifically looking at the football on the field, immediately, let's say this was to happen, next year. Let's say this year in this month, these divisions are out in the forefront. Oklahoma's probably your leader in the clubhouse to make it to the SEC championship game, right? They're, when you think about them versus A&M versus LSU versus Arkansas, they're still that team. And don't think, for a minute, a lot of these decisions and these thoughts aren't being made, understanding that we're probably headed to a 12-team playoff in, 2 or 3 years, right? So, yes, there's a school of thought. Yes, it's much easier for Oklahoma to make the playoffs from the Big 12. However, does the lack of competitiveness within the Big 12, Oklahoma's won 6 straight Big 12 championships, and it hasn't manifested itself to a playoff win or a national championship, in the kind of the New Year's 6 college football playoff era. Does a team like Oklahoma moving to the SEC, where, they might get a few lumps here and there, but at the same time, does it build from a recruiting perspective? Does it build more of a competitive advantage once they get to the playoffs, putting them into maybe a stronger position to consistently win and maybe even win a couple of national championships along the way?
There's something I want to jump in on there, Mark, real quick, that Jason pointed out. There is a well-known animosity right now between Oklahoma and the conference office for a variety of reasons over multiple issues, none the least of which is the TV deal and Oklahoma's place in that. If you're Oklahoma right now, you own the conference. You own the conference in football. You own the conference in several sports. Your leverage with the Big 12 conference office has never been more than it is right now. And it's interesting to see Oklahoma say, instead of using that, we're gonna, we're looking to give you the middle finger and hit the door, instead of using that leverage to their advantage.
Yeah, so Jason, it's interesting that you bring up possible conference and division alignment, because I found it intriguing that I found this online, that the SEC Network today showed a proposal, and knowing firsthand, working on the SEC Network and ESPN for 19 years myself, not that I was making power broker kind of decisions from the top, but being in management and understanding, okay, they just told us that we can do this and can't do that, and all these things, that this passed through enough layers of red tape in terms of certain people possibly being paranoid that, can we really release this? Can we talk about this? It's not official. Can we, and especially taking it to the degree of, here's how this would lay out. And let me clean up the graphics here. So now you talking about, guys, confusing the average sports fan. I think when you work in an industry, regardless of what that is, there's an assumption made, especially when you're servicing the public, that they are as ingrained and knowledgeable and keeping up with this as much as everybody that's making the decisions. And that's not the case. They have lives to live. They're interested in music and entertainment and fishing and other things. College football is just part of their lives. So this, to me, just reeks of confusing the public that are used to conferences and a portion of them divisions. And I run a college football channel, and I am sometimes surprised, and this is not a condescending remark. This is more about people living their lives and caring and being interested in other things, that even college football fans don't always understand the organization or structure of college football. Now, this, I believe, would be very confusing to people. You've got SEC Pod A with those 4 schools that currently reside in the SEC Eastern Division. Then you have Pod B, which would be Alabama, Auburn, Tennessee, Vanderbilt. So that's a mixture of East and West currently, but Alabama, Auburn being, of course, chief rivals, stay together. And then you've got Pod C, LSU, Texas A&M, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, that currently compete all in the same division. And then, of course, I think the major decision in all this is, do you split up Oklahoma and Texas to kind of integrate them more into the conference and not clump them together to say they're kind of the add-ons, as was the case 8 or 9 years ago with Texas A&M and Missouri, and maybe 30 years ago, 1992, Arkansas, South Carolina. So that's at least what was displayed today on the SEC Network. That is, again, I think that would be confusing, not to me, because I live it every day. It's not confusing at all, and that has nothing to do with the intelligence of people. But again, they are not focused on college football 20 hours a day to try to root through these things and understand them. I just think it would be confusing to people.
I think it's a horrible idea if they go to the 4 pods. I think it's dreadful. It starts to look like European Premier League soccer, and who's following which pod and which group, and it's ridiculous. And I think the people who are college football, 24/7 like we are, that's fine. We'll watch. It's going to take some time to learn it, and we'll get through it. And we'll make lots of mistakes figuring, having the wrong team in the wrong pod when we write an article or something, or, go on air to talk about it. I think, talking to people smarter than I am, people that I trust, like Jason and like some of our senior people at Last Word, we were talking last night about really to start with, you just go with 2 8-team divisions. And that way you still have a clean conference championship game division, the one division versus the other. You're probably going to split up Texas and Oklahoma, just as you said, for the integration purposes. You can actually even someone brought up the idea of, what do you do with everybody else in terms of still trying to get an at-large bid in an expanded playoff under that system. You do essentially what the Pac-12 did last year in its silliness of trying to finish out the season, is that's where you have your cross-division games right there. You have the number 2 against the number 2 on championship weekend, or number 3 against number 3, all the way through to play, and they're playing that game for, at-large bids, other bowl games, whatever the case may be. Other than that, you just play within your division, and you've got your out-of-conference games, and then you've got that final championship weekend game to get you to your 12 regular season games. And it's clean and it's simple, and college football and TV networks can understand it that way.
I want to respect your time, both you, Tony, and Jason, of course, so you guys do what you need to do. So we'll kind of take this in layers. So we've addressed the SEC. We could talk about this for 5, 6, 8 hours, but we'll move on now to the Big 12, which for many people, they've talked about confused. People bring this up all the time. Well, the Big 10 has 14 teams. The Big 12 has 10 teams. And I even have people that cover college football, and this is sometimes a typo out of the mouth, as we all have done it. Of course, that's an everyday occurrence. I dismiss those things, but that legitimately confuse the Big 10 and the Big 12,
right?
Because of the number of teams. So now we would have, what do they go back to? The Big 8. And I kid, because to be relevant or to even survive, they're going to have to add. Now, one of the major points that I brought up early was, there's not a bunch of Oklahoma and Texases out there to grab to bolster your conference. They don't exist. So who do you go get? If you're the Big 12/8 now, and you just want to survive in this and be competitive, you got to be competitive. You can't just throw together a league with Houston and BYU. Okay, come join us. Okay, we're okay. Iowa State on the field right now, currently going into 2021 and what we saw in 2020, is the best football product in this remaining conference. Maybe year to year, it could be argued Oklahoma State, TCU, but that's the top rung now versus Oklahoma, Texas, Alabama, Auburn, Florida, Georgia, LSU, Texas A&M. My goodness, Jason, what does the Big 12/8 do?
Good. That's a good question, Mark. I think you lead with maybe a call to Central Florida, and you don't have to your point, Mark, there's no one, there's not a big blue blood out there for them to get. So it's going to have to be, if they stay relevant, it's going to have to be sort of a patchwork conference, so to speak. I think you make a call to UCFs to gauge the interest there. You have, obviously it's not a huge brand, but recency, they've been strong on the field, and you get that Orlando market from a TV set perspective. So that's a thought. I mean, you mentioned BYU is sort of a, is kind of a brand in itself. There's some maybe challenges across the the paradigm of the sports world with them not playing on Sundays. I don't know how much that, kind of configures into the to the challenge of bringing them over to the conference. But again, another brand. Cincinnati's another team like that. So I think those are probably your initial options. Memphis maybe is another one, that you look at. But at the same time, Mark, if this happens, I don't think the Big 12 is in a position where it's considered a Power 5 conference anymore. Whether whoever they're going to get, kind of makes them in line with the American Athletic Conference in terms of a group of 5 conference that is strong, because you think of the other teams that they have in the conference. You mentioned Iowa State in terms of the product on the field, but as a brand, it's not there. As a TV set, as a from a marketing perspective, they're not there. You have West Virginia, which, was always kind of weird to me to have West Virginia in the Big 12. Kind of, we've talked about this, Mark, a lot, from a geography perspective, but overall, and then you've got you've got Texas Tech, you've got Baylor, you've got those schools that don't really bring a ton nationally to the table. So I think the Big 12 is in a lot of heat right now, a lot of hurt. If this happens, I think I think they were caught off guard for whatever reason. It seems it's kind of mind-boggling to me at this point. They could have been caught off guard, understanding where some of the animosity from Oklahoma's perspective. So, but I think these dominoes started to fall when Nebraska left the conference. They were in a position where they were, they have delusions, kind of like Texas A&M. It's not the 80s and the 90s, and I think Nebraska, their fan base and their administration feels like that's where they should be, and they're not there right now. So, but however, from a brand perspective, I think that took a big hit for the Big 12, and these dominoes had been falling. So, yeah, I mean, other than Memphis, other than UCF, you mentioned Houston. You get a little bit there from not really on the field, but you get a little bit there from a market perspective, having that Houston market. But other than that, I don't really see where the Big 12 would go. Me personally, I see there's a bigger chance that the Big 12 sort of just kind of folds. Unfortunately, there's been some, and Tony can speak to this much better than I could. There's some thoughts that if this happens, you have potentially an Oklahoma State, potentially a Texas Tech that could venture out west, and how bizarre would that look? We talked about West Virginia in the Big 12. You look at Texas Tech in the Pac-12, which is certainly something which would be crazy to think about. But you've got realistically a team like Iowa State and Kansas looks like a fit for the Big Ten. On the top, certainly. I think it would be interesting from a basketball perspective for Kansas. Obviously, we could spend, to your point, Mark, we could spend 5-6 hours talking about the downfall of Kansas football, in the Big 12, and in terms of it's just and I think Kansas
either 5 hours or one sentence. You go to one extreme or the other. You just
and I think Kansas kind of builds to the perception of the Big 12 as clearly the worst Power 5 team, in the country from a football perspective. However, they bring so much, understanding it's not really a revenue generating sport. Maybe it is at Kansas, but moving Kansas to the Big 10 probably bats a lot of eyeballs just in terms of looking at some of those matchups on the court. But that's just a different. Certainly, dominoes will fall in a lot of different directions. But just me personally, it seems far-fetched for the Big 12 to, unless they're able to get a team that maybe me or we collectively aren't thinking about right now.
Tony, and I'll let you take this in whatever direction you want, but I'll make a statement/question, and you can either tack on to that or go in what direction you were going into. Because the Big Ten's not in jeopardy of anything, except for falling further back as the second best conference. So on the field, we could have a debate all day about the second best conference. I think if we polled College Football Nation and media, the Big Ten would win most of those votes, but it's not decisive. It's not like there's not some kind of an argument, but the Big Ten appears to be on the field the second best conference. Now, in terms of money, some people would be surprised that there's step in step with the SEC right now. In terms of popularity, probably second. TV ratings second. First or second, they're right there. But this happens, and does the Big Ten just sit where they are, or do they make a move? And again, there are no other Oklahomas or Texases out there to keep up. Do you just grab a couple schools just to try to match the volume and the numbers?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack just in that one question. If you are the Big 12, I agree with Jason. You're in a lot of trouble because there aren't Oklahoma and Texas style programs. I think if you're looking to survive, you're going to put in a call to Cincinnati. You're going to put a call into Houston. Don't overlook putting a call into SMU because they've got the Dallas market. And, They're marketing down there. If you've ever been in Dallas in the last year or two, which I have, a considerable amount of time, their marketing down there is over the top with billboards and Sonny Dykes, come back home to Texas, for recruiting, things like that. So I wouldn't overlook that. I wouldn't overlook a call to them either, but none of those are going to sustain you the way Texas and Oklahoma do. So the Big 12 long-term, short-term could put a Band-Aid on the, gaping, hemorrhaging wound. Long-term, you're still on life support. And I think you start to see a breakup. But if the Big 12 starts to break up, I think we see a lot of dominoes going in a lot of directions, so that you wind up with maybe 3, super conferences out of the whole thing over the course of 5 to 6 years. Not immediately, but over the course of 5 to 6 years. And I'm seeing a lot of, I hope you don't mind, I'm reading a lot of the comments that people are putting in, because you got a really smart audience. And so I'm looking at some of these, and there's someone named Joey who had a really good point, which is the match of Texas and the SEC, not from a football standpoint per se, from an ego standpoint. And I mean that with all seriousness, and I assume Joey did also. Look, Texas has got an ego. The University of Texas has got an ego the size of the entire state. How do you blend in with Alabama, who, is convinced they own the conference, and, Nick Saban is really the de facto chancellor of all things SEC, and, Greg Sankey, for being one of the more underpaid commissioners in all of sports, is probably the best commissioner in college sports. How do those egos ever line up on any given day? It's just, there's no real answer. I just thought Joey had a really good point. It was something to think of. I mean, it's titan egos going in there. In terms of the breakup and where other schools go, I agree. I mean, the Big Ten probably just, grabs the best of the bunch that they can think of that will not necessarily help football, because I don't think there's anyone in the Big 12 that would be left over that would really add to Big Ten football. You're doing it to make sure you're keeping up in numbers and to think about other sports, right? So, Kansas makes you a better basketball conference than you currently are. Kansas State, Iowa State, add things at different sports. You're not doing it to add to the football part of it. You're doing it to add to the numbers and keep up with the neighbors across the street. And you're doing it to see what it brings you in other sports. There was someone named Christopher who talked about who commented about where this takes the other conferences if you start making all of these shifts, and what the Pac-12 would look like. Let me get this out there, because I see this repeatedly about BYU and Boise State and so on and so forth. And geographically, sure, they make sense, and it will never happen. The Pac-12 has a mandate on academics. You must be, by the Carnegie Educational Foundation, a Tier 1 research university. There are, and I had the list up last night, and I don't have it up now. Besides, I would lose my camera, so I won't do that to you if I pulled that up. But I will tell you that Boise State and BYU do not qualify to be in the Pac-12. That is part of the reason Colorado is in the Pac-12 with Utah instead of BYU and Utah, because BYU wanted in and they do not academically qualify. To that point, out of the Big 12 schools that would be left over, the Pac-12 cannot take Baylor, Kansas, or TCU. They are not Tier 1 research universities. They could take anybody else that's left over. The rest of them qualify. So, when we're talking about, where everybody starts to go, that's something to consider. The Pac-12 will not, to the best of our knowledge, we have a new commissioner who we're going to meet for the first time on Tuesday, Pac-12 Media Day, and Last Word will be there in person. So we're going to meet George Kliavkoff for the first time. And it was interesting. Kliavkoff even chimed in on all this chaos yesterday on his Twitter feed saying, hey, I thought my first month on the new job would be kind of boring. I guess not, because, of course, if we're going to talk all these conference shifts, the Pac-10 comes into play, and what happens with those schools.
It is a fascinating topic. And as was mentioned very early on even if this falls through, even if the SEC institutions voted down, I don't know if this is irreparable in regards to the damage that it would cause between Oklahoma and Texas and the rest of the conference.
I tend to think it is, Mark. I mean, I don't know at this point what would change for Oklahoma and Texas. I mean, Tony mentioned that Texas thinks an awful lot of themselves, so I think they would probably go independent before they would go sign a long-term deal, with the Big 12. And I think Oklahoma certainly is a little bit more about competitive advantage on the field. So I tend to think Oklahoma would probably be easier to persuade to come back, or stay long term within the Big 12. Certainly there's a TV stuff that they would want to deal with, but I think more than anything, it kind of floats out. It's like when you talk to your agent and say, hey, I want to trade. Essentially that's what Oklahoma has done here. They want to be out there in terms of there's other teams, because Oklahoma has been, we talked about years ago, rumored to the Pac-12. Oklahoma's been rumored, as having interest in the SEC. They've also had interest in the Big Ten as well. So I think, to your point, Mark, if this doesn't go through with the SEC, and I'm with Tony, I tend to believe that it will. I think at the end of the day, the SEC teams will probably vote, with the exception of Texas A&M and Missouri to a certain extent. I think that the SEC teams will vote for the betterment of the conference overall, not only from a competitiveness on the field, but, for the money aspect of it as well. But, if it doesn't, I definitely could see, Oklahoma still looking that way. But, if there's anything that could be salvaged, I think Oklahoma before Texas. And, while we're talking, I think it's interesting to note that the Big 12 athletic directors and CEOs are meeting together at 5 p.m. Central Time today to kind of discuss this whole situation. So, I think that brings more legs to it. And I think based on who was breaking these stories yesterday, I think we all knew that there was some legs to this, coming from the Houston Chronicle. Absolutely agree with Tony. This was A&M purposely leaking this, without a doubt in my mind, to get this out and kind of get this killed before it even gets started. And then, Oklahoma and Texas, basically a non-committal, non-denial, quote, basically, that states we're not going to address rumors at this time. So, a non-denial to me, obviously, at this point, kind of makes us say, hey, we're not going to talk about it. But yeah, that's true.
I like the point that Jason said, it's like asking, like you went to your agent and said, I want to get traded. So basically Oklahoma right now is Aaron Rodgers, right? I mean, they got wronged by the executive offices at the Big 12 conference. And so now they've demanded a trade, and it's pretty hard to put that genie back in the bottle unless they're going to give Oklahoma the keys to the mansion, because I agree, if it doesn't work out with the SEC, I think Texas ultimately winds up going the Notre Dame route and being an independent. They've got their own TV network. They can do whatever they want with that. They don't have to share money with anybody, which, we've talked about what would happen if they went to the SEC. And so I think that would be the most viable long-term route for Texas if the SEC avenue doesn't work out.
Yeah, and I think one point here, Mark, before you take over, that I wanted to add to that is, we in the past there was some discussion, Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, are they a package deal? I know that we know that that's certainly not the case now. However, I will say that Oklahoma and Texas, not from a legislature perspective, but I think Oklahoma and Texas are a package deal. Texas, if Oklahoma was to leave, Texas will not stay in the conference, based on your biggest on-field brand leaving, and vice versa. Oklahoma, if Texas were to leave, if they were to go independent, Oklahoma certainly wouldn't stay in the conference, long term, because the viability of the conference kind of goes by the wayside there as well.
Tony, clearly the most important comment made today, and we've been at this for quite some time, and there's been a lot uncovered and discussed and a lot of informed comments by both of you, so I appreciate it. But King Vegeto, UCLA will start the season 3-0. Tony, that's all that matters.
We look. I think if UCLA comes out of the out of conference schedule at 2-1, I think UCLA fans should be very, very happy with that. I am seeing too many UCLA fans on boards around social media looking at what happened to LSU last year and thinking that's the same LSU that's coming to the Rose Bowl on Labor Day weekend. And I assure you, doing our homework and our research the way we do around here, that is not even close to the same team. I mean, last year's team lost 17 starters off the national championship team. This is a now fully functioning LSU team again, and they are not to be taken lightly in any capacity, and certainly not by a team that's 10-21 over the last 3 years.
Yeah, I think that LSU team that's headed to the Rose Bowl should have their heads screwed on straight and be in the right mindset to play a football game. Not that it won't be competitive and entertaining.
Right. Oh, I think it'll be a halfway decent game. UCLA is a huge unknown right now. They're one of the most veteran teams in the country, but a year older does not always mean a year better. You've got to put it together on the field, and so they have a lot to prove.
Jason, Tony, thank you so much. You guys made this happen. It's a much better discussion when hearing from knowledgeable sources, of course, and I rely on you too. And thank you so much for coming through. Appreciate that so much. Again, Jason and I will get together again tomorrow, and I think we might touch on this again, possibly if unless we want to carry over the Big 12 offensive line rankings. They may take precedent over this, but unless we want to take the deep dive and maybe rank the top 30 offensive linemen in the Big 12, we may want to do that rather than discuss this insignificant potential move. But we might have time for it. So everybody join us on our Oklahoma live show, 2:30 Eastern, 1:30 Central on the Oklahoma channel. Tony, Jason, you guys are the best. Everybody join them on Last Word on College Football. It's Last Word on College Football. Anything that you guys want to tease us about in regards to what's coming up on the site here soon?
Yeah, you know what? We've been doing a lot of great conference breakdowns, going through all the way even to the MAC and the Sun Belt. And Jason's done some great work on that. We've got a lot coming out from SEC Media Days, and Big Ten Media Days started today. Did not go without notice that Mike Loxley got exactly 0 questions from the media when his time at the podium was done at Big Ten Media Day. That was kind of weird. But we've got a lot of coverage coming out of that. We've got some brand new Notre Dame coverage that we have hit on in the past couple of weeks. So we are, you can feel the nearness of the season and of camps opening up as the intensity of the work product that we're putting out picks up.
I think I'll post a video with my response to Mike Loxley's comments at Big Ten Media Day. Maybe just put up color bars or something in a, tone.
It would work.
Jason, anything you've got in store there?
So we'll probably start doing some schedule analysis for Oklahoma here in the next coming weeks and do some fall camp previews once that gets started.
Are those going to be SEC schedule analysis?
Well, it's funny. I saw, when you talk about that, Brett McMurphy kind of posted, tweeted out talking about day, and I don't even know what day it is from a SEC Media Day perspective. But
day 4,
Or they talked about day 5. Steve Sarkisian and Lincoln Riley will be up. So let's do it. It's a foregone conclusion at this point, right? Speak it into existence.
And we will be live at Pac-12 Media Day next week, so we will have a lot from that. We'll have some time with the new commissioner, see what his thoughts are on all of this conference, shenanigans. And we've got one coach actually who opted yesterday to not show up, Nick Rolovich from Washington State, because the Pac-12 has mandated that you either show proof of vaccination or proof of a negative COVID test 48 hours. And so he had the chance to do the COVID test, and he opted not to do that either. So he's just going to be calling into conference days via Zoom. But there will be a lot coming out of that as well, so we'll have a lot of in-depth coverage on that next week as well.
We'll be calling, Tony.
You got it. You know where to find me, pal.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for your time and expertise. Appreciate it so much.
All right, man. Anytime.
Thanks, guys.
All right, folks. I had attempted and wanted to set this up as a call-in show. My call-in account right now is at 0. And Mark, of course, used the ATM, fix it. It should be fine, right? But somebody else deals with that. I don't have access to the account. So we will come back at a later date, meaning most likely the same date, but at a later time to talk college football. These conference media days are going on from the ACC, the SEC, and the Big Ten today. And I've been so locked in on Oklahoma and Texas because this is monumental to college football. In some ways, this would be the biggest story in college football in a decade. Even bigger than what transpired 10 years ago, because Texas A&M and Missouri are not the brands and the teams on the field that Oklahoma and Texas are. And then not just that it adds Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC, but as we've discussed over the last 65 minutes, what impact this will have on the Big 12, most likely becoming a Group of 5 conference or being dismantled completely and vanishing from the map, and the impact on the Big 10 trying to keep up with the SEC. The ACC really has no viable options geographically to add on except for UCF and West Virginia. And then, of course, the Pac-12 in last place currently. What would they do? And would they take on some of the Big 12 teams, as they would most likely be searching for a home in the Pac-12 first and foremost, except maybe some of those northern teams, schools, Iowa State and Kansas, may go to the Big 10. Great thoughts from all of you on the live chat. We're going to be here constantly as we typically are. We don't have any planned live streams for the rest of the day until our Oklahoma show tomorrow at 2:30 Eastern, 1:30 Central. But as new information unfolds, I'll be back on here. I wanted to unveil the SEC Network pod proposal, and then certainly unveil basically my thoughts and some other insight as we got from Tony and Jason on what this means in terms of the competition on the field, what it means in regards to the academics, and what certain conferences and schools allow to be joined with, the brands, the images, the traditions, all of that, the money involved, the geography, the rivalries, the competition on the field is what I'm most concerned with. Is that I just believe this puts us in a place where the SEC, already the best conference by a decided gap, may not be huge, but it's decided, where the SEC adds one of the 5 best football programs in the country right now, Oklahoma, and one of the 20 or 25 best football programs in the country right now, Texas. But in terms of brands and in terms of ability to be great, we're talking about 2 of the top 8 or 9, that I just think it wipes out the competition. There is nowhere that the Big 10 or the Pac-12 can go to add this type of brand and competition weight on the field. They just can't. There's nowhere to go. So I think it's to the detriment of the sport that the SEC is going to even more so dominate. And that's not good for the sport. That's not even good long-term for the SEC, because they're going to kind of be playing themselves. This may hurt places like Ohio State and Penn State and Michigan and Notre Dame in terms of trying to pull players out of the South, because there's going to be an even greater draw to keep those players in the South, because they're going to look at the competition and say, why would I want to go play in the Big Ten when nobody's paying a whole lot of attention to the Big Ten? If I'm a 5-star or a high 4-star, except for a few games a year, where the SEC is where it's at. And so that's been magnified by this potential and probable move. I appreciate all of you being here. Try to get as many comments to the screen, and we try to address as many comments and questions as possible. So this, much like NIL, although this is more of a known factor, we've seen it happen before. Texas A&M, Missouri, Nebraska, Maryland, Rutgers, Colorado, Utah, and other teams moving from conference to conference, and how the dominoes may fall. I drew up right here possibilities for each conference. Once this takes place, the Pac-12, now Tony dismissed some of these options because of the academic scientific research tier 1 status that is required by the Pac-12, but I just jotted down as possibilities for my own thought process and trying to envision and post some content that would deal with what is college football going to most likely look like, or what should it look like. There's always a difference there. What I'm projecting or thinking is going to happen versus what I think should happen. What should happen is Oklahoma and Texas should stay in the Big 12. That's what should happen. And actually, there should be another conference, and we should have 6 12-team conferences, and Texas A&M and Missouri should go back to the Big 12, and Notre Dame should join the Big 10. And there's a lot of things that should happen but won't. But I look at it from a football standpoint, a competitive aspect, and to keep the fabric of college football intact. When people think SEC football, there's a culture, there's a vibe, there are rituals and traditions, and there's a brand. When people think Big 10 football, the same thing. Big 12 to a lesser extent. Pac-12, that's being torn to shreds. And it's to the detriment of the sport. It hurts the sport. But the Pac-12 options, again, considering the academics, which I did not when I made this list: Boise State, BYU, Kansas State, TCU, Baylor, Oklahoma State, Iowa State, Texas Tech, San Diego State. Options for the Pac-12. Options for the Big 10: Kansas State, Oklahoma State, West Virginia, Cincinnati. The ACC could go to UCF, South Florida, Notre Dame, of course. They've already got the affiliation there in all the other sports. West Virginia. And the Big 12, just to stay alive: Houston, Memphis, SMU, Tulsa, UCF. That's pretty much what we've got right there. When you shop Amazon, folks, please use the link in the description section of the videos. It's the same shopping experience, same exact price that you're going to pay. Not another penny comes out of your pocket. Please use the Amazon link in the description section to help us build the channel. Also, go to voiceofcollegefootball.com, and what you get there is a lot of great content as we build this out. But also keep in mind, I don't have it right here on this particular app, but go to voiceofcollegefootball.com, and if you'd like to write for us, then go to the link at the top of the page that says write for us. We have a store there, a lot of great merchandise. Gear up for the college football season. Go to voiceofcollegefootball.com, go to the store, pick your favorite team, go nuts. Also, we have a partnership with these fine folks that drew this up for me, which was phenomenal. I am still astonished at how amazing that looks. And so I had no knowledge of this coming my way, but the fine folks at Tri-State Wood Sketch, which I have incorrectly stated in the past. I corrected the banner. I should have a correct banner, so don't go by that. I'm sorry. It didn't save. Tri-State Wood Sketch. Tri-State Wood Sketch, Mark. Tri-State Wood Sketch. You buy one, you get one free. If you drop my name, Voice of College Football, Mark, however you want to state it, just say that Mark sent you, and you get buy one, get one free. Send them a photo, and look at that. They will make it look amazing on whatever surface that you choose. It was great to see everyone here. Again, we have no scheduled live streams for the rest of the day, although I want to address this situation a number of times as the news unfolds. And also, I want to get on the other channels, specifically Ohio State, Michigan, Oklahoma, Miami. I know Avante Williams, there's a situation involving him. We'll address that in the next day or so on the Miami channel. We just posted another Florida State Live yesterday, as well as Ohio State Live. We hope to have Greg Peterson on from Husker Online to break down Big Ten Media Days for us today as well. Right here at the Voice of College Football, we appreciate the support, and we will see you next time.